By the autumn of 1942, American destroyers were sinking Japanese cruisers in complete darkness. At ranges and angles the Japanese commanders could not detect until shells were already in the air above them. How a nation that had entered the war with almost no surface search radar capability managed to reverse a years-long Japanese dominance of Pacific night combat inside 18 months is a question most naval histories answer incompletely. And this is the part nobody talks about. In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was considered by its own officers, by British naval observers, by the small number of American admirals who had studied its doctrine closely, to be the finest night-fighting surface force on the planet. This was not an idle boast built on institutional pride. It was a conclusion grounded in 2 decades of deliberate training, specific weapons development, a tactical philosophy that had been refined through hundreds of fleet exercises conducted in darkness off the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy had built its night combat capability around a particular assumption. That was that no enemy force would ever be able to locate and track Japanese ships in darkness with sufficient precision to direct gunfire at them before the Japanese themselves had opened fire. For most of 1941 and the first half of 1942, that assumption was entirely correct. The weapon that overturned it was not a warship and not a gun. It was a piece of electronics mounted in a waterproof housing on the mast of an American destroyer, designated by the Navy Bureau of Ships as the SG Surface Search Radar. The SG had been developed at the MIT Radiation Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where a group of physicists and engineers working under contracts organized through the National Defense Research Committee had. Between early 1941 and the spring of 1942, solved a series of engineering problems that had prevented earlier American radar sets from providing the range resolution and bearing accuracy that tactical surface gunnery required. The critical improvement was the shift to a microwave frequency of approximately 3,000 megacycles. That allowed the SG to distinguish between separate ships at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards and to track their positions continuously on a planned position indicator, a circular scope on which each target appeared as a distinct bright return against a dark background. The first SG sets reached the Pacific Fleet in the late spring of 1942. The initial deliveries were slow. As of August 1942, when the Guadalcanal campaign began, fewer than 30 American surface combatants in the South Pacific had the SG installed. The training required for its effective tactical use was uneven across the force. The operators who had worked with the equipment longest had developed an intuitive understanding of what they were seeing on the scope. But many crews were still learning what a false return looked like, how to compensate for sea clutter near the center of the display, how to calculate a firing solution from radar bearings without reverting to the optical instruments their gunners had spent years relying on. The equipment was in hand. The doctrine for using it was still being written in real time, sometimes under fire. The Battle of Cape Esperance, fought in the waters northwest of Guadalcanal on the night of October 11th into October 12th, 1942, was the first engagement in which American surface radar played a decisive role in a night surface action against the Japanese. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a force of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers, tasked with intercepting a Japanese reinforcement convoy running down what American sailors had already begun calling the slot. At 23:25, the heavy cruiser Helena, that carried an SG set operated by a trained crew, acquired Japanese radar contacts at approximately 27,600 yards and reported them to Scott. The Japanese force, under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto aboard the cruiser Ioba, had no knowledge that they had been detected. The engagement that followed lasted less than 30 minutes. Goto was mortally wounded on his own bridge within the first minutes of gunfire. The cruiser Furutaka was sunk. the destroyer Fubuki was sunk. The Japanese force disengaged in confusion. The reaction inside the Japanese Navy to Cape Esperance was not, at first, a recognition that radar had been the decisive factor. Japanese staff officers who reviewed the battle in the weeks afterward attributed the outcome to navigational error, to poor lookout discipline, to the specific tactical positioning of Scott's cruisers. That had crossed the Japanese column's course at an angle that negated the advantages of Japanese long-lance torpedo doctrine. This misreading of the battle's actual lesson was consequential. It allowed Japanese commanders to continue planning night operations under the assumption that their fundamental tactical advantages remained intact, when in fact the most important of those advantages, the ability to detect an enemy force first, had already been negated on any night an SG-equipped American ship was present. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought across the nights of November 12th and November 14th, into the early hours of November 15, 1942, produced the first Japanese operational commander to articulate clearly what was happening. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe led a bombardment force of 2 battleships, the Hii and the Kirishima. 11 destroyers into Iron Bottom Sound on the night of November 12th. He was met by a much smaller American force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan that included 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, none of which were optimally positioned and several of which lacked functioning SG sets. The action that followed was one of the most chaotic surface engagements of the entire war. Both Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed. 2 American cruisers were sunk. But the Chao Hie, the flagship of Abe's force, was hit by more than 85 8-inch and 5-inch shells during the engagement, lost her steering, was unable to withdraw before daylight. American aircraft found her the following morning and sank her. It was the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. It had been crippled in the dark by American gunfire directed partly by radar. Abe was recalled to Japan and relieved of command. In the internal discussions that followed his relief, surviving accounts record that he was one of the first senior Japanese surface officers to state explicitly, in documents reviewed after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's Naval Analysis Section, that the Americans appeared to have developed a means of directing accurate gunfire in total darkness at ranges beyond what any unaided optical system could achieve. The SG radar was being installed at an accelerating pace through the winter and spring of 1943. The facilities responsible for its production included the Raytheon Manufacturing Company's plant in Waltham, Massachusetts. By the end of 1942, Raytheon had delivered approximately 200 SG sets against Navy orders. Through 1943, as production methods were refined and component supply chains were stabilized, delivery rates increased substantially. By mid-1943, the SG, or its improved successor variants, had been fitted to virtually every American cruiser and destroyer operating in the Pacific. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, fought off the coast of Bougainville on the night of November 1st into November 2nd, 1943, demonstrated how completely the tactical balance had shifted in the 13 months since Cape Esperance. Rear Admiral A. Stanton Merrill commanded 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers against a Japanese force under Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori that included 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 6 destroyers tasked with disrupting American landings at Empress Augusta Bay. Merrill's ships carried SG radar throughout the force, and his crews had trained extensively in radar-directed fire control procedures. The action lasted approximately 3 hours. Omori's force failed to sink a single American combatant, though 1 destroyer was damaged by collision. The Japanese cruiser Sendai was sunk, and the destroyer Hatsukaze was sunk. Omori withdrew and was subsequently relieved of command. Japanese after-action analysis of the battle noted with evident difficulty that the American force had appeared to open accurate fire at ranges that exceeded the limits of Japanese night optical systems by a factor the analysts were not able to fully account for. The definitive engagement was the Battle of Surigao Strait, fought in the early morning hours of October 25, 1944, as part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led a force of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers northward through the strait in an attempt to reach the Leyte Gulf landing beaches. The American force waiting for him under rear, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, consisted of 6 old battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers arranged in a blocking position across the northern end of the strait. Oldendorf's destroyers, all equipped with SG radar, began tracking Nishimura's column at ranges exceeding 40,000 yards in complete darkness, and launched coordinated torpedo attacks that had been planned using radar plots before any Japanese lookout had reported contact. By the time the battleship gun lines opened fire, Nishimura's flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, had already been hit by multiple torpedoes. The Yamashiro was sunk at approximately 4:19. The battleship Fuso had been struck earlier and sunk separately. Of the 7 ships in Nishimura's force, only 1 destroyer survived to withdraw. Nishimura himself went down with the Yamashiro. The officers of the surviving Japanese surface forces who were interrogated after the war's end in 1945 by teams from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's Naval Panel returned consistently in their responses to the question of American radar. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as chief of the Naval General Staff Operations Section and later commanded the 2nd Air Fleet, told his interviewers that the Japanese Navy had understood by late 1942 that the Americans possessed surface search radar of meaningful capability, but had persistently underestimated both the accuracy of the equipment and the speed at which it was being fitted across the American fleet. He stated that Japanese naval intelligence estimates of American radar production had been consistently low, that no senior staff officer had anticipated the rate at which radar-directed night gunnery would be integrated into American tactical doctrine at every level of the surface force. The production numbers behind Fukudome's admission were straightforward. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry delivered approximately 150,000 radar sets of all types to the armed forces. The SG and its successors accounted for several thousand of those sets specifically allocated to surface combatants. The radiation laboratory at MIT, that had been established in October 1940 with a staff of fewer than 40 scientists, had by 1945 grown to a workforce of nearly 4,000 people and had developed more than 100 distinct radar systems across the full frequency spectrum. The laboratory's total wartime research budget exceeded $500 million. The industrial contractors translating its designs into production hardware, including Raytheon, General Electric, Westinghouse, RCA, had collectively committed manufacturing capacity on a scale that had no parallel in any other nation's electronics industry. What the Japanese Navy had built in 2 decades of nocturnal fleet exercises off Kyushu and Shikoku was a tactical system of genuine excellence, optimized for conditions that assumed visual detection and optical fire control as constants of the problem. The American development of microwave surface search radar did not merely add a new instrument to the existing tactical framework. It changed the fundamental terms of the problem itself, invalidating the Japanese investment in long-lance torpedo doctrine, in night lookout training, in the specific weapons handling procedures that Japanese destroyer crews had drilled until they could execute them in complete darkness without a spoken command. A tactical system optimized for one version of reality does not automatically adapt when the underlying conditions change, particularly inside a military culture where the institutional investment in the original system is large, and the evidence of its failure arrives through the medium of ships that do not return. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded the largest Japanese surface force assembled for the Leyte Gulf operation, survived the battle and was interrogated extensively in October and November 1945. His remarks on the question of radar, recorded in the Survey's Naval Analysis Division report published in 1946, were precise. He told his interviewers that the Japanese Navy had known of American radar capability in a general sense from approximately mid-1942 onward, but that the rate of improvement in that capability had exceeded every estimate the Naval General Staff had produced. He said that by 1944, American radar had effectively eliminated the one domain in which Japanese surface forces had maintained a reliable advantage over their American opponents since the beginning of the war, that no compensating Japanese technological development had been available or was forthcoming to replace it.